You may have heard it said that Western democracy is based on ancient Greek democracy. Well, the democracy of ancient Athens did serve as an inspiration for modern democracy, but Athens did more than simply inspire America's founders. It also scared the dickens out of them. You see, there's one thing missing from the Greek model. The Greeks had no firm foundation for higher law. Yeah, the Greeks believed in gods, but they were gods like Zeus, who Greek mythology tells us took the form of a swan to seduce or rape a princess named Leda. Compare that to a god who took the form of a man to die on a cross for the sins of the world. Our God is perfect goodness, the ultimate ground of morality. The ancient Greek gods were perfect disasters in the morality department. So what happened? Well, ancient Greek democracy became mob democracy. The majority behaved as if they were God, as if they were the higher law. And in the end, no one's life, liberty, or property was safe.
The abolition of slavery in Europe was one part of freedom's march. The rise of democracy is another. This story begins in ancient Athens. The Athenians based their economy on slavery, but by the 5th century BC, they were allowing all free male citizens, some 10 to 15% of the population, into the governing process.
One of the great things about Athenian democracy was that it widened political participation. It widened it beyond the aristocracy. That did not exist in any other part of the Greek world, let alone the world that the Greeks called the barbarians.
This early experiment in democracy would inspire future generations, but the experiment itself proved unsustainable.
The question of whether the democracy in Athens is the forerunner of American democracy is a very important question. And too often people make the easy assumption that you can just move from one to the other and assume you're talking about the same thing. But that's predicated on some fundamental misunderstandings. Athenian democracy was wild democracy, a democracy which could decide one thing today and another thing exactly the opposite the next day, without ever being responsible for its decisions.
It wasn't long before the citizens were themselves the tyrant. They put commanders to death without a fair hearing. They plundered the rich, and they crowned their guilt in one of the most infamous trials in history, the trial of the philosopher Socrates. Socrates was charged with refusing to recognize the official gods, with introducing new gods, and with corrupting the youth. All of this was based on little more than his association with the leaders of 2 coups. But it was enough. He was convicted and sentenced to death.
What's interesting is that when he was put on trial, Socrates couldn't appeal to a natural law or a divine law or something that was universal that the state had to live up to. The Athenian democracy that executed Socrates knew no higher law than the arbitrary whims of the majority of the population. That was a fatal flaw.
While the Greeks were discovering the limits of their democracy, the early Romans were at work building a republican form of government. It was a step toward government by the people, but only a step. Their system was closer to an aristocratic oligarchy, democracy for the few, and eventually, it began sliding toward an imperial dictatorship. Cicero, Cato, and others tried to resist the slide by grounding human rights in universal principles. They found these principles in a philosophy called Stoicism.
And they began to articulate things like the necessity for having our contracts enforced, the necessity for protecting our life, the necessity for protecting our labor and the acquisition of our goods, the necessity for having procedures to be able to vindicate our rights against our fellows.
The problem is, Stoicism was a very good philosophy on a lot of levels, but it simply did not shape the worldview of the Roman Empire enough to have much of an impact on the culture. It was essentially a philosophy of a small number of elites. On top of that, Cicero was heavily influenced by skepticism. So in essence, what he was saying was, you know, these Stoic ideas are really good and they make sense, and I think they're probably true, but we can't really be sure. And that's hardly enough of a firm philosophical foundation to build a complete revolution in the culture.
By the middle of the 1st century BC, Rome's attempt at representative government was crumbling. Cicero was slain as an enemy of the state, and his head cut off and displayed in the Forum. The empire would now be governed by a series of men who were treated as divine figures above the law. Emperor worship became the norm. The Jews, with their unbending religious scruples, were excused from this practice for a time, but the pull of history seemed to be against them. In 70 AD, Rome laid siege to Jerusalem. When it was over, nearly 1 million Jews were dead and the temple destroyed. "60 years later, the Emperor Hadrian slew another 580,000 Jews in a bloody effort to stamp out their religion. The Jewish scruple against emperor worship must have seemed a pitiful thing against such power, and yet, in the end, it was the Jewish view of imperial authority that prevailed. In the 4th century, the Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity. This growing religion carried at its heart the Jewish conviction that the emperor was only a man, and that he served under the authority of the one God. Now, the minority Jewish view was the dominant view.
After Constantine, there was at least an acknowledgement that there was a higher authority than the will of the king. Human nature being what it is, many kings and monarchs then claimed that their will was the same as the higher authority, that they were in fact the direct representatives of God. This, of course, is a distortion. But the Christian principle that the highest authority in the universe is the will of God and is not the will of the monarch, and furthermore that the image of God is in each man and is not just in the monarch, would eventually help to fight against tyranny.
At one level, the fight was a subtle battle of ideas fought over centuries, but at times it was the stuff of high drama. One such incident occurred during the reign of the Christian emperor Theodosius, late in the 4th century.
One of the effects Christianity had in the Roman Empire was the abolition of gladiatorial matches. Because of the Christian value of human life, killing people for entertainment was no longer acceptable. With the loss of gladiatorial matches, the next step was a rapid increase in chariot racing. Well, in the city of Thessalonica, when one of the prominent charioteers propositioned the young son of a Roman commander, he was arrested. The Thessalonian mob was so enraged by this that their hero on the tracks was under arrest, that they stormed the Roman garrison and killed the commander and his aides. The Emperor Theodosius heard about this and he decided he needed to do something about it. So what he said is that he was going to sponsor chariot races in Thessalonica. It was a ruse. When people came to show up for the races, instead of charioteers, they got Roman soldiers who slaughtered 7,000 people, men, women, and children, indiscriminately.
The slaughter was business as usual for Roman emperors accustomed to maintaining power with an iron fist. But what happened next would have been unthinkable under the old empire. One morning, soon after the massacre, Theodosius was about to enter the cathedral with his imperial entourage. He was met by Ambrose, the Archbishop of Milan. The priest refused Theodosius entrance into the church and commanded him to do public penance for his crime.
He said this on the front steps of the cathedral, in broad daylight, with the crowd surrounding him. And the amazing thing about this is that Theodosius complied. He dressed up as a pauper and stood on the steps of the cathedral several times over a period of months, proclaiming his guilt and asking for forgiveness. This is an unbelievable event. Earlier Roman emperors would simply have had his head removed. then and there on the spot and walked into the church. No one challenged the emperor that way, publicly.
In the time of the day, what Ambrose of Milan did to him was revolutionary. It was like calling a god to account.
It was the first of many clashes between church and state.
The conflicts between the church and the state in the Middle Ages don't show either the church or the state at their best. You see self-serving churchmen and you see self-serving kings, each battling for power. But the very fact that the church could say, this authority rivals that of the crown, shows that there was a true principle at work, that the will of God is higher than the will of the king.
The fact that the church insisted on its independence, that the church was not simply going to be a department of political authority, created the social conditions for the possibility of free space throughout all society. Politics was not going to be allowed to fill up all of the space in society. Something else was going to be there. And when you have one something else there, namely the church, then other something else's, the family, the guilds of the Middle Ages, business enterprises, professional groups, etc., they find their space too. And suddenly we have this rich social mix, which is, in one respect, an essential condition for democratic self-governance.
In medieval England, a far-reaching effort to limit royal authority came during the reign of King John. The king had infuriated many of his barons by trying to handpick an archbishop, by trading land away to France, and by raising taxes to make up for the lost revenue. A group of barons and their knights entered London and pressed the king to parley with them on the field of Runnymede by the Thames. There in 1215 AD, they presented King John with the Great Charter of Political Liberty, the Magna Carta. At the center of the rebellion was the Archbishop of Canterbury, Stephen Langton.
The Magna Carta articulates rights, political rights that we take for granted. The right of the English Church to be free from interference by the monarch and by the state. The right of taxation by consent. The right of trial by jury, the right of habeas corpus. There had to be a reason given for arrest, and it had to be defensible. The Magna Carta is a fundamental document of our governmental system. Its principles are re-articulated throughout Anglo-American history on many occasions. It is the mother document of all of our political documents to follow, including the English Bill of Rights, the American Constitution, the American Bill of Rights, etc. It was that charter that was probably drafted by Stephen Langton. Stephen Langton actually organized the barons to parley with the king. He was the man of action at that place and at that time.
Stephen Langton appealed to the Hebrew prophets in the Old Testament who were constantly confronting kings about their misbehavior. And to Jesus' words, give to Caesar the things that are Caesar and give to God the things that are God's. Now, Langton interpreted that as saying that Caesar does have authority, but his authority is not absolute. He has to give to God the things that are God's, and as a result, there are automatic limitations on royal power.
The Middle Ages once were depicted as a benighted sleep before the Renaissance. But there is now a broad consensus among historians that medieval Europe was an age of profound transformation.
Remember what God told the prophet Samuel when the Israelites asked for a king? It is not you they have rejected, it is me they have rejected as their king. And then he told the Israelites and warned them in so many words that if you concentrate all this power in the hands of one man, it won't be pretty. You don't want to go there. The Israelites didn't listen, and they paid and paid and paid. And then later, In the Christian era, Europe spent more than 1,000 years working its way toward a system of checks and balances. It wasn't easy then. It isn't easy today. Our only hope for avoiding tyranny is to remember the ultimate source for all authority. Not any human king or president, not the high court in Washington, D.C., but the highest court, the name that is above all names. Jesus said, "Judge not, lest ye be judged." What exactly did he mean? Now imagine if we had captured Adolf Hitler at the end of World War II. Now this guy was responsible for spearheading a global war of aggression bent on domination. He slaughtered millions of Jews. The war eventually cost 50 million lives. Now imagine he sits in the witness chair at Nuremberg and says, "Don't judge me. Judge not, lest you be judged. I needed to find my own path." Now, no morally sane person, Christian or otherwise, would accept that argument for a moment. When Jesus told us not to judge, he was commanding us not to write off someone as lost, not to slot someone into the irredeemable category, not to pretend that we can know the thoughts and motives of a person in the way that God can. But at the same time, the Bible is very clear that we are to hate what is evil. Love the sinner, but hate the sin, even the sin in our own lives. When God commands us not to judge, he's not trying to ruin our freedom. It's just the opposite. Remember the words of Jesus in the Gospel of John. When the Son sets you free, you will be free indeed.
Some people seem to think that the way to defend principles of freedom and democracy is to appeal to moral relativism. The idea that we ought not to be imposing our values on other people because, after all, there is no moral truth, there are only subjective opinions. What's amusing about that is that it is the worst possible way to defend the ideals of freedom and democracy, because moral relativism, if it does anything, undermines those ideals. If all things are relative and matters of subjective opinion, then the belief in the dignity of the individual, the belief that people ought not to be enslaved, the idea that people should have their freedom respected, the idea that all citizens should participate in government and have a right to, the democratic ideal, all of those would be undermined. There would be no reason for believing those. The contrary opinions of Stalin or Hitler would have just as great a claim to governing, to ruling, as our own claims for democratic freedom and liberty. If freedom and democracy are in fact defensible, then it's not because there is no absolute truth. Rather, it's because that is the truth. The truth about man is that man has a special dignity that requires that his fundamental freedoms be respected and that he be entitled to participate as a full citizen in the affairs of the community.
The history of the West is filled with stories of violence and oppression, of racism and sexism, of noble ideas twisted into the service of cruelty. Such evils are, of course, larger than the West. They are the story of the human race. The mystery for historians is not that such evils persisted. The mystery is that from the base stuff of human nature, political, economic, and religious freedom were born in the West.
What we need to understand is how Western culture came to be one that favored all of these things. Well, some people suggest that we got where we are because of geography, that we were not in the disease belt and that we had good land and plenty of rainfall and that we just lucked out. The problem with that is civilizations have risen and fallen around the world, and there was a time when China was ahead. The geography didn't change to pull them back. People say, well, it was steel, or it was sailing ships, and it was agriculture. But those are part of the thing we're trying to account for. Everybody had astrology, but nobody else got astronomy. Everybody had alchemy, but only the West got chemistry. Alfred North Whitehead, in a lecture at Harvard in 1925, put it beautifully, shocked his audience. Shocked his old co-author back in England, Bertrand Russell, who was busy being a professional atheist. But he said, it's because they thought that the universe did have rules, that these rules could be discovered because God was rational, that they went and looked for the rules. And of course, the more remarkable fact is they found them. It's pretty amazing. And it does come back to what we think about God. The rise of science, the rise of civility, the end of slavery, all of these things has to do with the fundamental conception of God. But an image of God as rational, as just, as loving.
The question is, where did Europe learn its dignity? Where did European men and women learn that they were people of inalienable or inherent dignity and value, who had a right to be consulted about how they were ruled? Where did Europe learn that the prince is also subject to the law? Where did Europe learn that there was a moral law written on the human heart? Moral truths that we can know by reason. Where did Europe learn that persuasion is better than coercion in the doing of the public business? One answer to that is that it learned it only in the Enlightenment, only in the 17th century and the subsequent history embodied by the French Revolution. I think that's a desperately foreshortened and truncated answer. European humanity learned its dignity in the school of Christian freedom, in the rich social pluralism of the medieval world, in those biblical stories we see in the glass of Notre Dame, which taught European men and women that they were made in the image and likeness of God, that they were somebody, not just something. To understand how the freedom project in the modern world emerges not in China, not in India, not in the Islamic world, but in Europe, and in Europe's child, America, then we have to come to grips with the biblical part of the foundation of Western civilization.
With this faith, we will be able to work together, to pray together, to struggle together, to go to jail together, to stand up for freedom together, knowing that we will be free one day. This will be the day. This will be the day when all of God's children be able to sing with new meaning, my country, tears of thee. We land of liberty of thee I sing. Land where my fathers died, land of the pilgrim's pride. From every mountainside, let freedom ring. Let freedom ring from every hill and molehill of Mississippi, from every mountainside. Let freedom ring, and when this happens, when we allow freedom ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last.
7 lessons, 70 minutes, 2,500 years of history. Now that all the lessons have been heard, what is the conclusion of the matter? You know, we live in an age when popular TV and music and movies encourage the idea that Christian morality stifles freedom and progress. But the history of the West tells a different story. Its truth-telling gives us another powerful way to give a defense for the hope that is in us. Christianity has been the greatest force for freedom and progress in the history of the world. The body of Christ is not of the world, but it is in the world. May it continue on until the day when, at the name of Jesus, every knee shall bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth. Thanks for joining me for the Birth of Freedom. I'm Dave Stotts.